In this second video on the history of American clothes and fashion, we're going to look at the 19th century, the 1800s, and really look at the Victorian age at the end. Early in the 1800s, men's coats still had tails in the back, but they were cut higher in the front. On the left, you can see what I mean, that it's not very cut high in the front. On the right, it is. Men began wearing long trousers instead of knee breeches, and on the left you can see the breeches, and on the right the longer pants. Longer trousers were at first used in the daytime, and the old breeches for formal attire at night. Soon, however, use of breeches faded altogether. During the 1830s, men's pants were first tailored with buttons visible down the front of the fly. Mormon leader Brigham Young discouraged people from wearing them, calling them fornication pants. During the 1800s, men wore a frock coat, often over a waistcoat, sometimes double-breasted as shown here on the left, with a high, stiff collar. Men often sported the high stovetop hat, which you kind of think of Abraham Lincoln. As the 1800s passed and you get to the middle of the 19th century, you do start seeing less formal and stiff suits, often referred to as, at the time as sack suits. Some primitive forms of handheld clocks had existed for centuries, but in the antebellum age, the number and quality exploded with the growth of interchangeable parts and mass production techniques. It became stylish for men to have one in your coat pocket attached to your belt with a chain. Now this fell out of style in the 20th century with wristwatches. As the 1800s began to pass, women's waistlines were lowered to a natural waistline, and the skirts became fuller and more bell-shaped. Several petticoats were worn, and by the late antebellum age, steel cages supported the weight of the petticoats. They were the famous hooped skirts you think of in the antebellum age. There were several different sleeve styles, but short puffed sleeves were generally worn for the evening and long sleeves for the day. As the empire style of the very early 1800s faded, corsets were increasingly common again, now often made with metal and not whalebone. Women wore shawls rather than coats, and bonnets or hats were worn outdoors and linen caps indoors. During the early 1800s, hairstyles became very elaborate with raised top knots, and the crowns of bonnets or hats were designed to accommodate them. When the Civil War developed, soldiers early on wore a variety of uniforms because the localities and states provided them. The North, with all of its industry and urban and towns and so forth, was better able to produce a common universal uniform and soon adopted blue. Now you can see here the Union officers, and obviously the picture at top was sort of colored after the picture was taken, but you can see the color. Blue or gray had been used fighting Indians earlier because they stood out on the battlefield, making it easier to identify friends and enemies. The South adopted cadet gray as its official uniform color, but it lacked the textile and industrial capacity to adequately mass produce these uniforms. During the war, therefore, the Southern troops often had much more of a mishmash look than the Northern troops did. Sometimes to get better uniformity in the color, soldiers wore a more buttercut color, more sort of dust brown than gray in the Confederacy. They got this by dyeing clothes in a dye made of butternut bark or walnut hulls. I should note that one of the Union generals, a man named Ambrose Burnside, wore his facial hair uniquely and long down the sides, and that's where the term sideburns comes from. Improved mass production of clothes by the Victorian age of the late 19th century reduced prices and increased variety. You begin to see ready-to-wear clothes bought so-called off the rack and in standardized sizes. Extended, that idea extended back to the early 1800s, but in the antebellum age, it really exploded in the late 1800s. The Boston merchant Isaac Merritt Singer had patented the first sewing machine that was practical for everyday use in the antebellum age, but by the Victorian age in the 1800s, the technology dramatically improved. New machines included improvements like cross stitches. The spread of electricity late in the antebellum age and the early 20th century obviously had a profound impact on all clothing manufacturing. Synthetic dyes were introduced in the Victorian age of the late 1800s. This meant that many more varieties of colors in clothing were possible. Most Victorian men, however, still wore plain and simple white, brown, or black. The mass production led to the expansion of the fashion industry, located in the so-called garment district of New York City. The fashion industry had already been big business in Europe, where the major designers were becoming internationally known, and the American designers were sort of looked down upon. It was common for them to travel to Europe for the seasonal Paris fashion shows, usually paying for the rights to a few styles. The spread of the department store, a larger, more diverse merchant, began to market their purchases of various styles. You'd have racks of individual styles. New styles were also encouraged by the arrival of new types of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, such as the Italians, and each group brought their own cultural and clothing traditions. They were, however, often cheap labor in an age of laissez-faire, and they were therefore exploited, working in what they called sweatshops, and ultimately leading to strikes and labor unrest. By the late 1800s, the hooped skirt type of dress was out of fashion, but some women favored the bustle dress. A bustle was a fashion accessory that was worn underneath dresses and skirts to support and add volume to the garments. Bustles were made of straw filled with cushions and a steel superstructure, which was either sewn into the skirt or attached around the waist. Bustle dresses were often adorned with ruffles, laces, and bows. Smart tailored long-sleeve jackets and long skirts were worn in the daytime, while sleeveless low-cut bustle dresses were favored for formal evening wear. And you can see a couple of pictures of these bustle dresses here. The bustle style did not last long, and by the turn of the 20th century, younger women embraced the new so-called artistic dress. Artistic dresses were cut much more loosely than conventional attire and did not require restrictive corsets. Women's hairstyles became longer as a general rule at the end of the 1800s, but these Victorian women always wore their hair up, almost never down in public. By the turn of the 20th century, corsets began to fall out of fashion, and early forms of brassieres were introduced. The girdle took the place of the corset. The girdle was more concerned with reducing hips rather than the waist. By the late 1800s, more men wanted neckwear that was easy to put on, was comfortable, and it would last the entire workday. Neckties were soon designed to be long, thin, and easy to knot, without accidentally coming undone. This is still the basic necktie design worn by millions of men today. A version of the modern necktie was, of course, the bow tie, and you can see kind of some of the evolution here in these pictures. That's Samuel Clemens, by the way, in the middle there. By the late Victorian era of the 1800s, wealthier men dressed more formally for dinner and evening socializing. In time, in America, this formal evening attire evolved into what was known as the tuxedo, which descended from the so-called black tie attire, which utilized a formal white shirt that had been earlier worn with a tailcoat. In this period, tuxedos often maintained the tailcoat. By the end of the 1800s, the tall stovepipe stop type hat had shrunk to a so-called top hat. And later, the bowler hat shown on the right was popular in Victorian attire for men at the end of the century. Facial hair, both beards and mustaches, including the famous handlebar mustache, kind of oiled at the end, were popular in the Victorian culture of the late 1800s. I should add that the late 1800s was also a period when the Great Plains were being fully settled and there were cattle drives, and that meant that they were actually cowboys. And your image of the cowboy is actually correct. Tall hats were very, very popular because they blocked out the sun, and they'd have a bandana, not because they're going to rob a bank or something, but because it blocked out the dust. And they would have chaps, and you'd have stirrups, and all the attire you expect with a cowboy holding a lasso, and it was an accurate image. As a matter of fact, people back in the East sort of romanticized the West and its wide open spaces and its freedom. And you get things that in American culture in the late 19th century, like the dime novels and the first Westerns. Anyway, the image of the West has remained popular throughout the 20th century, and you can see this even today in the popularity of Western wear, cowboy hats and boots, and you got a belt buckle the size of a dinner plate. This kind of all harkens back to the late 19th century Great Plains and the cowboy and the image that was created around the cowboy. In the middle of the 19th century, a New York dry goods merchant named Levi Strauss saw the gold being discovered in California and moved his business to San Francisco. There he developed the idea of using denim as pants for the miners and frontiersmen because it was so durable and difficult to rip. His pants, of course, became known as Levi's, and you can see one of the original pair on the left. In the 1880s, his company adopted the two-horse emblem still used today, which you can see on the right. As Levi Strauss was growing his business in the late 1800s, a self-taught chemist named Charles Goodyear developed a way to manufacture vulcanized rubber, which is more pliable or moldable and waterproof as well. He first began to see a use for his rubber in the stiff collars of Victorian era men and began to launch a successful business. Others quickly saw opportunities with shoes. In 1892, the U.S. Rubber Company introduced the first rubber-soled shoes, which quickly became popular and known as sneakers because they were quiet when walking and people feared that their burglars would wear them. They'd sneak around. Yet another company, Spalding, designed its own rubber shoe for the new sport of basketball in 1907. Of course, in time, this rubber would be used in the tires of automobiles. Spikes on shoes went back to the Renaissance, but the first modern patent for a spike shoe was recorded in England in the 1860s and used for cricket and soccer. By the end of the 19th century, American track runners had adopted it, now calling them cleats. Of course, cleats would later be applied to the new sport of American football. While the Victorian age was patriarchal, this did not extend to babies. Young children were dressed the same, whether boys or girls. Each wore a form of a dress and long hair. This wasn't seen for babies as feminine. It was just practical, given cloth diapers and the way children played. So you have a girl on the left and you got a boy on the right. I don't know if you ever seen pictures like little Franklin Roosevelt, but he looks just like a girl, long hair and kind of in a dress. As boys grew older, they wore what were called knickers from the Knickerbocker suits. They were loose-fitting pants, usually held up by suspenders, and they would extend just below the knees. By the age of 10 to 12 or so, usually the boys were wearing adult-style long pants. Boys or younger men might wear the newsboy-style hat, a form of the old English rider hats. They would grow in popularity with older men much later. In any event, this concludes the second video on the history of American clothing, this one focusing on the 1800s, the 19th century, and I'm including the Victorian age in that.